for myself, following that story trail has led to some really magical and wonderful places and some really magical and wonderful people. So I think I'm just enthusiastic about the idea of other people beginning to follow that trail. And it's not about being a storyteller. I think it's more about bathing in story and accessing non-modern perception and non-modern ways of thinking. I think that's the underappreciated gift of story, and it's out there and it's really accessible.
Today we are in for a treat. I just got into all the good things with traditional Scottish storyteller Dougie Mackay. He's a skilled storyteller who's deeply rooted in the rich cultural traditions of Scotland and is involved in nature connection and intercultural exchange. Here's some of the things we get into. The Scottish Cèilidh, a kind of vibrant community event where people bring something to offer, a poem, a story, a song, and this is a place where storytellers learn the art, get inspired by each other, and sometimes make this calling their lives. And of course, we do have a story in this episode. Dougie tells a tale of an old man's quest to retrieve his cow, his beloved cow, from the land of the faeries. And through this seemingly simple story, we enter into a little narrative ecosystem, which is full of invitations to ponder the interrelationships between nature, culture, ethics, and the mystical. Dougie describes his recent trip to Jordan and how exchanging stories, food, and song with the people there countered the cliched propaganda that he'd often heard from media in the West about the Middle East. We explore how stories shape our perspective and how where stories with good guys and bad guys foster binary thinking in every area of our lives, if we're nourished with rich and nuanced stories, the likes of which we find in traditional cultures all over the world, including your own ancestry, oh dear listener, and mine, if we're nourished by those rich and nuanced stories, we learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously, multiple ways of looking at things, not one conclusion, one right way. All this and more we explore in this episode. And for this particular episode, you can watch it as a video as well, linked below. See you on the inside. Welcome to Story Paths, the place to practice thinking in stories, for life, business, art, and all of these woven together. Why stories? Because they carry cultural teachings. I'm Theodore Lowry, your host. I've traveled with stories in many ways over the years, in fiction, non-fiction, business, myth, and ceremony. And I help others work with stories too. This podcast and the accompanying workshops are story weaving labs where we try stories on for size, trim them down, sew them together, and weave entirely new ones. This is the place to practice storying. Now, in we go. Welcome, Dougie Mackay.
Good to be here.
Dougie is a storyteller based in Scotland who's actually going to be traveling here to our neck of the woods on the west coast, Pacific Northwest, Salish Sea, west coast of what's known as Canada. And I've come in contact with your work, Dougie, through some friends like Tad Hargrave and others, and heard some of your stories, your delightful tellings on YouTube. And yeah, really glad to be meeting you here in this way, and looking forward to hearing you tell stories in person as well when you come this way. And this is a podcast. The tagline of this podcast is the stories we tell and the stories we live. So I could set the stage with that in the sense that I know you've also done work with Nature Connection, working with different groups. In one of your interviews, I heard you talking about binary thinking compared to nuanced thinking, and how these old stories, is my experience as well, these old stories can help us to think outside of binaries and hold multiple truths simultaneously. So these are some of the territories I'd like to get in with you. But actually first, if I may, I'd like to come in with the role of storytelling in culture and community. So in particular, this Scottish type of event called the Cèilidh. Is that how you say it?
Yeah.
Cèilidh. It's interesting. It's a Sanskrit word as well. It's pronounced the same way. It means like playful.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah. So a Cèilidh is a, can you please describe a Cèilidh for us? This
Yeah,
kind of
that's a really
gathering.
nice place to start. So if you came to Scotland today and you went to one of the cities or some little town on some remote Scottish island, if there was a Céilidh being organized in a hall, it's most likely dancing. It's most likely a band with fiddle, accordion, guitar, someone calling the dances. And it's like a set of traditional dances that anyone who's been to school in Scotland knows. But the old Céilidh was simply a gathering. And in the old Céilidh, it was much less formal. It was more like gathering in a circle. And I feel like storytelling in Scotland today is still, it's still in the spirit of the Céilidh. And to expand a wee bit more, Céilidh is you'd have the host who welcomes people in. Everyone who gathers is expected to offer something into that kind of collective pot of entertainment. So it's not like I'm the storyteller, you're the audience, you listen while I narrate all evening. It's the host, if they've got a bit of kind of sensitivity about them, they maybe think, okay, we bring in a story now. Then someone over here sings a song. Someone else feels really moved to stand up and recite a poem. Someone else might have like the same joke that they wheel out at every Céilidh. You know, not everyone's a performer, but people would be encouraged to offer something. And if you're not a performer, maybe you bring a loaf of bread, maybe you bring the cake, but maybe you've just got a riddle. You know, maybe it's something really small, but people would be encouraged to collectively share entertainment. And I think there's a really simple poetry to that that resonates in the modern world. It's non-hierarchical, it's in the circle, it's richer for diversity. You know, if it's the same person telling the same story every week, like that Céilidh's going to get old pretty quick. When you've got visitors, when you've got travelers, the Céilidh is more exciting. And yeah, maybe that's enough on the Céilidh for now. But I feel storytelling has managed to be preserved for longer in Scotland through this Céilidh culture. So even if it wasn't being performed in theatres, even if it's not something that was seen as a kind of high or professional art, people were still sharing tales on winter's evenings by the fire in remote places in Scotland.
Mm, that's beautiful. When you're describing that, I'm feeling like this is something that weaves people together. I'm also feeling that it's a place where amateurs are welcome.
Yeah.
You know, so somebody's got a little something, like you say, you know, okay,
Yeah.
we're going to try to pull this story off.
Yeah.
And when there are places where amateurs are welcome, the art lives, right? Because there's places for people to learn, and some people are going to be really into it, and some people, you know, just a little story time to time, telling a story time to time is enough. But it's when there's a place for newbies to come in and have their offering welcome and see how others do it, the longevity of the art is assured, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. And I think it's something that's still really strongly articulated in like contemporary Scottish storytelling culture. There's like as you speak, it makes me think like we would still almost call the predominant style of storytelling in Scotland is hearthside storytelling, the type of stories you could tell by a fire in someone's kitchen. You know, the style is as if you're in someone's home. And in other parts of these islands, in other parts of Europe, the pull is towards performance storytelling. You know, you weave a longer narrative arc. You're doing like 90 minutes solo. You're working with a band. You know, it's taking a massive step towards theater, which is also cool. You know, like that's fun. But it's like people will come from that theatrical storytelling background and be like, this is a bunch of amateurs in Scotland. What's going on? Why are you not developing this to a high art? Where's the long form storytelling? And it's because we're still rooted in this culture of inclusion and welcoming people to tell their first story. So that's almost like a stylistic choice or a cultural choice that's being asserted in Scotland.
I love that. And how would you say these two different types of storytelling, the performance storytelling and the more hearthside storytelling, how would you say these differently exist in community? How do they affect communities differently?
It's a good question. You know, I don't know if I'm totally the authority to answer, but I guess like performance storytelling usually ends up in a theatre. So the people who go and see it are people who go to theatres, who tend to be of a certain socio-economic class and already interested in the arts. Whereas I feel like the hearthside thing can happen anywhere. You know, you've got more chance of reaching people in everyday situations. So I think they will exist alongside each other at a storytelling festival, but I think they move in different directions. Yeah, one is towards theatre and where certain people go, one is towards firesides and like informal spaces. But I think there can be, yeah, I do both, you know, and I do like long form stuff. That's definitely where I like to test myself as an artist. But I love carrying the spirit of the Cèilidh. And I think for me, the best storytellers, even the ones doing long form, even the ones who are totally at ease in a big theatre, they're the ones who still speak to people in everyday life. They're the same people who would tell a story like on a bus or speak to the taxi driver. Like I've met some storytellers and they're very much performers, but I don't feel they would be good crack at a Cèilidh, you know? It's like, really, I want to meet the storytellers who can come to a Cèilidh and they're going to be good crack. And they don't need 200 people to be in an audience. They're quite happy with whoever's there. So I think there is a distinction.
Well, that's interesting because that's what I was going to ask you about is what might be the fertile third ground between these two groups. You know, let's say there's a young lad or lassie who's coming to the Cèilidhs and they're just, I love this. And you might have been that lad, you know? Because I want to take this really seriously. Like I want to really develop my craft and become professional, if that's you know, it's maybe a modern word, but somebody who really wants to live into that. And of course, there's well-known storytellers and there's people who teach it to others. So how might that tradition of people whose lives are largely given to storytelling interact with the Cèilidh, with that circle where everyone's welcome to have a go at it?
Sorry, I just want to clarify the question. Like how, so people who want to take it further, like
so does it happen, you know, within within the Céilidh, people are coming to have a go at it. And I'm guessing amongst them, there's some that they want to make it their lives.
Yeah.
So would they could keep on coming to the Céilidhs? Would they
Yeah.
outshine everybody, or how
Yeah.
might those two fields interact?
Yeah, I guess, if you're looking to be a career storyteller, the Céilidh might be a really good anchor. It might be a really good fire to orbit around. But ultimately, you're probably going to have to go and do some training. You're going to have to do some study. You're going to, like, if I'm talking about my own story, like,
Please.
my storytelling's developed when I've studied with elders and in quite a formal way sometimes. And that started in Scotland. And then I recognized, if I don't want to be limited. I don't want to just be comfortable in a Céilidh space. I don't want to just be telling in a Scottish style. And I studied with a British Caribbean storyteller called Jan Blake.
Oh, yeah.
And spent 2 years with her. And again, Jan's great crack. Jan's really fun. She's an interesting person and she's a good storyteller. She's not just a performing artist. So that's where my storytelling, I guess maybe it's me devoting to the craft. It's me working with masters. It's me stretching my boundaries, my realm of familiarity. So I think that is part of the game too, for people who want to do it professionally or do it properly, or that's something I would encourage. But no matter where I go with storytelling, my anchor is this Céilidh space, this hearthside space, and that's a beautiful route to have. I think that's kind of the home. Yeah.
Do you remember, Dougie, one of the first stories that you told in a space like that? Would you want to share it with us?
You want me to talk about the story or to
tell it if you can, if you'd like. I'm thinking one of the really early ones when you're finding your legs and.
Okay, so give me a minute. I'll give you a bit of a preamble.
Okay.
So first story I found that first time I saw storytelling was a guy called Daniel Allison, who's about my age. He had a concert in Edinburgh. And I was like, storytelling, what's that? I go to hip hop gigs or see singer-songwriters. And I saw him telling stories and I'm like, I recognize something in that. I recognize something from growing up in the Highlands. And he told a story called Whoopity Story, which is, kind of a Scottish version of A Grimm's Tale, which was really interesting. I was like, wow, I could see he'd done some creative things himself, but I could see the bones of it were really old. So I got looking for stories and I'll give you two choices. The first story I told was a Mackay story called The Chain of Sand of a 17th century chief who needed some magical assistance. So I found this story, told a bunch of teenagers, I thought, okay, I'm doing youth work, I'm doing outdoor youth work. These guys don't listen to anything, they never sit still, they never pay attention. Can I hold their attention with an old folk tale? I'll try something different. So I told them this story and they were totally mesmerized. And at the end of it, they realized they're kind of like, oh, wait a minute, we're too cool for this. We've been sitting listening to a story about fairies and a witch. And one of them goes, how could that even happen? And the other one turned around and goes, it's magic, you dick. And I was like, that's so good. That's so good. So that was my first story told. And then I'll give you the other option. The other story that carried me a long way in my early years of storytelling, and is one I've told many times over the years, is one that I heard from the Skye Sheniki, an old Sheniki up in Skye called Shoras McPherson.
Hmm.
And it was the first, I would say the first like really strong medicine tale. That's my language, not his. The first medicine tale I heard from these islands that still felt really old and pure and crystal clear. So I tell you what, you've got three options. You can hear the story I first heard from Daniel in Edinburgh. I can tell you the story that I told to the teens, or the story that I told a lot in my younger years from Shoras up in Skye.
May I have two and three? Two now and three at the very end of our conversation?
Yeah, I mean they're pretty long.
Are they?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's quite
it's a bit much, yeah? Okay, better to pick one.
Let's see how time goes. If not, we do more in person.
I have to say I'm drawn to that third one, especially the medicine tale.
Yeah, let's do it.
Although it's hard to give up, and I hope I'm not angering the listeners by choosing when they wanted to hear another one.
Yeah, well, there'll be plenty of options to come and check it out in British Columbia this year.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just take a moment to kind of move out of conversation mode and just create space for the story to come in. Okay. There was no doubt about it at all, at all. The cow in the stall wasn't Norman's cow. It might have been the same breed, it might have looked like his cow. You or I might have thought it was his cow. But Norman, he knew it wasn't his beloved Ailey. For when he spoke to Ailey, she would wiggle her ear and moo in soft response. And when he spoke to this thing, nothing. And what's more, Ailey, she would give him the creamiest, frothiest milk in all of the Isle of Skye. Whereas this changeling gave vile, blue, pussy stuff that was fit for neither man nor beast. So it certainly wasn't his cow. And this was a serious thing for Norman. He was known locally as Tormod Krupach, or Limping Norman. And whilst he'd been fine and fit in his younger years, an illness had come upon him, where his ankles, his knees, and his hips had become swollen and sore. It was hard for him to make a living out on this island in the west. He had to get help bringing in the harvest. Once or twice, he'd even had the embarrassment of getting his neighbour's help to milk his cow. And so without her, he had nothing. He lived from the milk. He depended on her for warmth and companionship. And he thought about what he could do. It was a beautiful, clear summer's day, just a few wisps of cloud in the sky. The gorse was golden on the hill. And being this sort of time and this sort of story, he thought, there's nothing else for it. I need to go and visit the wise woman. And so he made his way slowly and painfully down the glen. The sea was glittering in the distance. He could see the jagged peaks of the mainland beyond. And eventually he came to the wise woman's cottage and he knocked on the door. The door creaked open. Ah, Norman, it's yourself. Come in, come in. And she bade him to come in and sit by the fire. She gave him dark tea with just a dot of cream. She gave him oat cakes and butter. And after they had caught up on the news and the usual chit-chat, her eyes narrowed. She spoke in a different voice and said, "Now, Norman, what really brings you here?" And he said, "It's my cow. She's been taken. There's something else been left in her place." And the wise woman narrowed her eyes. She looked out the window a while, then fixed her gaze back upon Norman and said, "Norman, did you by any chance curse your cow?" "Curse my cow? I would never do such a thing," he said. "She's more than a cow to me. She's my friend. She's my companion. I would never speak a bad word against her." But the wise woman was having none of it. She pointed and said, Norman, now think long, think hard. Did you maybe even curse your cow without meaning to? And he thought a while. And eventually he spoke and said, oh, aye, now you mention it. It was just yesterday. And she'd given me such nice, creamy, frothy milk that I wanted to say thank you. And I reached down to pick up an extra handful of hay, and as I was moving past her, she bumped my hip against the side of the stall. And it was that painful, I said, God damn it, Ailey, can you not stand still? Ah, Norman, you cursed your cow. And through cursing your cow, you made a gift of her to the wee folk, to the good people, to the Dina She, to the fairy. And he said, well, what can I do? You know, I'm a poor man. She's all I've got. She shook her head and said, Norman, you know as well as I, there are no guarantees with the fairy. But I tell you what, if you follow my words to the letter, then you have a chance of bringing her home. Whatever it is, I'll do it, he said. And she told him this. She said, go home and get dressed in your finest clothes. Take a mallet, take a horseshoe nail, go out to that cow in the byre, in the cowshed. Find the dumb spot, the spot above the pelvis that they used to press when the cow wasn't giving milk. Find the dumb spot, take the nail, take the mallet, and whack. And he wasn't too impressed with that idea, but what choice did he have? He thanked the wise woman. He made his way painfully back up the glen. And he thought, well, what can I wear? I'm a poor man. He had a pair of boots made out of deerskin, barely worn and well made, and he slipped them on to start. He had a shirt woven of sky linen, woven by the hand of his mother and dyed golden with saffron, and he buttoned that up. He wrapped around a long length of tartan. He tied it in the Philomore style of kilt. And he wrapped it all up with a strong belt made of bullhide. And dressed in his finest clothes, he took a nail, he took a mallet, he walked out to the cowshed. And when he saw this beast, the hair stood up on the back of his neck, but he thought, no, for Ailey, I shall do it. He went to the cow, found the dumb spot, he took the nail, he took the mallet, and whack, and whoosh, he found himself lifting up from the ground. He floated out of the cowshed, he floated back down the glen. Again, the gorse was golden on the hill, he could see the sparkling sea in the distance, and he floated out across the land towards one conical-shaped hill. As he got close, he saw an opening, and he flew right down that opening, down a long tunnel with flickering flames on the wall, and he landed with a bump in a chamber. And all around him, in that chamber, were little people. People like you or I, but no bigger than his knee, dressed in old traditional clothing. And as he dusted himself off and painfully stood up, an old man, a wee old fairy man with a long grey beard and bushy eyebrows, stepped forward, looked up at Norman and said, Norman, what brings you here? He said, I've come for my cow. Ah, Norman, you cursed your cow, and through cursing your cow, you made a gift of her to us. You can't just come down here demanding her back. And Norman protested. He goes, look, you can see I'm a poor man. Ailey's all I've got. She's more than a cow to me. She's my friend. She's my companion. I depend upon her. And the fairy chief thought about this for a while, and there was a murmur amongst the fairy folk. And eventually the fairy chief spoke again and said, I tell you what, Norman, if you give us gifts in return, and if you can prove you love your cow as much as you say you do, then maybe you'll take her home. Well, whatever I've got, you're welcome to it, said Norman. And the fairy chief called forward the older fairy men and said, what would you have from this man? They looked up and down. It's a fine pair of deerskin boots. With our fairy magic, each one of us could have a pair of boots as good as his, if not better. And Norman slipped off his boots and handed them over. The fairies were delighted. The young fairy men were called forward. They claimed his bull-hide belt. They were equally impressed. The older fairy woman came forward. They claimed his tartan. They thought of all the fine garments they could make with their magic and that piece of well-made cloth. And eventually, the fairy chief called forward the younger fairy woman and said, "What would you have from this man?" "It's a fine shirt, woven with the sky linen, if we're not mistaken, with our fairy magic. Each one of us could have a fine garment of clothes as good as his, if not better." But this time Norman paused, for this was the last thing his mother had given him, and the last thing he owned. "Ah, Norman, you don't love your cow as much as you said you did," said the fairy chief. And resigned to giving it away, he unbuttoned his shirt and said, "Gladly, you shall have this too." And so, handing over all his clothes, the fairies were delighted. They inspected it in the torchlight. There was a murmur of excitement, and eventually the fairy chief spoke up again. "Norman, you do love your cow indeed, and you will take her home, but seeing as you have given us good gifts, we have a gift to give to you." And he was quite chuffed. He wasn't expecting anything else in return, and he watched as the fairy woman, young and old, gathered up nettles, gathered up witch hazel, gathered up other herbs and plants that he didn't recognize. And they made bunches. And they took those bunches towards him, and they whipped him. And they whipped him, and they whipped him, and they whipped him around the ankles, the knees, and the hips. And it was that painful he screamed. And as he screamed, he found himself lifting up again, out from that fairy chamber, along the tunnel that led out of the hill, out across the fertile glen and valley, and landed softly in a meadow not far from his home. And as he looked up, what did he see but a cow, exactly the likeness of his own? And he turned round and said, "Is that you, Ailey?" And she mooed and wiggled her ear in soft response. So proudly he stood up, he took his cow by the horn, he made his way towards his home, towards his croft. And as he was walking with his cow, there was some neighbours peering out of their window, and they said, "There's Norman with his cow, and he's naked." And it was true. He was as naked as the day he was born, but his legs were as strong and as straight as they had ever been. So from that day, he was no longer known as Tormod Krupach, limping Norman. He was known as Tormod Long, naked Norman.
Yeah.
But I think with his cow back, he was happy enough. That's the end of that story.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I know sometimes after stories, there's an invitation for the listeners to consider parts that are staying with them, that are alive for them. Is that something you often do?
Yeah, I do that on, when that's the context. But yeah, if there's a moment that strikes you or stands out for you, I'd love to hear it.
I just want to give a moment for the listeners in the future
okay.
to do that themselves. Consider in this story if there's a moment that is staying with you. For myself, it's especially the soft acknowledgement of the cow at the beginning and the end, that, oh, it's you, yes, we're back. And also where he was reluctant to give up the shirt that his mother had given him, the only thing he had from his mother. But then he gave that as well. Also, I loved the gradual introduction of place in the story. You know, gradually find it's the Isle of Man, and then there's the cascading grass, and we're gradually learning more about him and the place he's in and his condition as we go through the story. I really appreciate the details came just as needed in a very natural way. And this parallel between how the woman said, oh, you've cursed your cow, and therefore you've given her as a gift to the wee folk. And then that elder amongst the fairies said, oh, you cursed your cow, you've given as a gift to us. That little parallel is, yeah, I'm really appreciating the creation of it and the parallels within it, these softly presented parallels that give this rhythm to the story. And I like that there's no clear moral takeaway as well. I appreciate that. I mean, you know, careful what you say to your cow, that could be one, or to anybody, you know, but I appreciate that it's more of a place to explore than a place to come away with a single message.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I could respond to a number of those things, but just with the last one, I find it much more exciting when we've got to work for, you know, a so-called moral or message. And I think these kind of, is it didactic stories, the ones that are kind of trying to persuade you to think in a certain way? Like, I don't know, maybe they're great in like primary school or something, but most of us want to, I think there's something a bit more cryptic about the cultures that are, about the ideas coded in these old stories. And I love the idea that like what you get from the story will be different from me.
Yes.
And it's not right or wrong. It's not like this is the one message, we've all got it. You know, it's like, what is in this story? There's an invitation to dream with it, to walk with it, to sit with it, to chat it. And we might come to conclusions, and we're not going to be 100% that we're correct. You know, we can't necessarily find ourselves in that position of authority with this story. We're directed towards a position of curiosity and not knowing. And for me, that's kind of radical in the modern world. And it's totally contrary to how maybe we witness so much of the dialogue in modern media spaces, people trying to argue their point and batter their rightness over the head of someone else. And I think there's something in the cosmology of stories and woven into the fabric of these old tales that invites inquiry, that allows wonder, that recognizes not knowing. And at the same time, there are certain what might be seen as cultural truths or cultural values woven through it. Like, yeah, don't curse your cow. Be mindful. And it's very simple. As you said, this story is it's quite gentle. It's very soft. It's got a very particular rhythm. It's, as modern humans, it's almost kind of hard to take it seriously. It's like this man and his cow. But once upon a time, you know, the livestock were life. And that core essence of the power of speech is something we find right across the Gaelic world in stories, in blessings. And I think what I also find myself tracking is it's like stories in dialogue with each other. So if I hear this one story, I might come to the conclusion that, okay, yeah, there's something about the power of the word. There's something about impeccable speech. But if I start to look for more stories and this theme turns up again and again and again, I feel more confident in saying, yeah, okay, this is a a cultural code. This is something that was important, that was firmly believed, that our speech has power.
Mm.
So it's one thing that shows up in this story, but it shows up in lots of Gaelic Celtic tales. And again, as a storyteller, we're like, okay, yeah, what we're doing is important. It's not just entertaining the kids, that's part of it, but there's the culture directs us towards an older potency in words that maybe we don't fully recognize in the modern world.
Hmm. I really appreciate that. I feel that the stories we hear greatly affect the way we think.
Mm.
And as you say, in modern discourse, so much of the, so much that goes on is some battle between which side is right. And the underlying assumption is that if one side's right, the other has to be wrong. And there's this very binary thinking. And in a lot of modern media, of course, you've got that's the bad guy and that's the good guy. And one thing I remember Jan Blake saying is she's really drawn to stories where it's not clear. You've got this triad of characters, for example. She told this great story about a water buffalo and a hunter and the hunter's mother. Maybe you know that one. And they're in this somewhat antagonistic relationship with each other, or mixed relationship with each other. And at one point in the story, I might, I really want this one to win out. And then, oh no, but shouldn't have done that. And I can't settle in any place morally and just have that be my person. I'm always shifting around. And so then stories that we hear affect our capacity to hold different truths.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing that really draws me to old stories, is because there's no clear one conclusion to take from the whole thing, which, as you say, it might be helpful if it's something, stay away from raging rivers,
Yeah.
stay away from alligators, be careful. There's a place for stories with very simple takeaways. But a story like this, like you told, I feel that it's inviting us more to, I think of it as a forest glade. And where would you like to explore in that? Would you like to explore a bit about the faeries and how they live and their relationship with the human world? Explore about our relationship with animals that we tend, and how that's changed over time, and what that might be, and how we could change that in our times. Explore the man's relationship with his community, his having a disability and the change of that. There's different places we could settle for some time in the story, and we don't need to pick one forever, as opposed to a binary debate where it's, which side are you on? You can just be on one. It's very boring, and the stories, if we have stories that are full of nuances and different possibilities, I feel it seeps into our entire cultures, like our cultures.
Yeah, I think we need or we benefit from having story-rich cultures. And as you say, I feel like this story is image-rich. So we might spend time on, him giving away his shirt from his mother.
Mm-hmm.
What does that one moment represent? What is it saying about the character? What is it saying about the sequence of the story? What is it saying about us? What's the mother's shirt we won't let go of that's holding us back?
Mm-hmm.
There's these different lenses we can take, but I think there's something so refreshing. I think when I first found these tales, not just from Scotland, I remember when I first came across an Inuit tale, like the story of Sedna, and I was like, oh my God, how can that be the ending to a story? It just does not fit with anything that I've heard from like European fairy tales. And there was something so raw and so other that it was captivating. And I feel like my awareness just stretched.
Would you mind telling that story just in a nutshell for people who don't know it?
Yeah. Yeah, I know there can be a sensitivity around telling tales, but in essence, there's a beautiful woman, raven black hair. And again, there's different versions of these stories in different places, but the one I know, beautiful woman, raven black hair, she's not interested in any of the people that come to court her. And over time, her father gets concerned. He's like, Sedna, come on, I'm getting older. I can't hunt forever. You need to marry. And eventually someone comes across the ocean in a canoe. And he's got walrus tusk glasses. He's got long furs. And he sings this enchanting song. And in this enchanting song, he promises her soft fur beds. He promises her meat every day. And she's captivated by his singing and his promises. And so they're wed. And her father's delighted. And she hops in the canoe with the character. They go out across the ocean. They end up in this rocky island. And she's like, this is strange. They climb the rock face. And at the top of the rock face, there's this circle of sticks. He's like, this is our home. And she's like, what? This nest on top of a rock in the middle of the ocean. And day after day, there's inevitably no soft furs. There is no meat. She just gets brought raw fish. Her husband goes fishing each day, brings her raw fish. And it's so hideous. She's absolutely repulsed by this and disappointed by her lot in life. And one day the husband comes home and he trips, and the walrus tusk glasses fall from his face. And she sees these little beady eyes and she goes, what ugly bird's eyes you've got. And then he starts laughing and he pulls off his skins and he reveals his long grey feathers. And she realizes she has married a fulmar. She's married this seabird. And so next time he goes off fishing, she cries out to the wind. She's like, Ajah, Ajah. And I can't remember what she calls. She calls to the wind and she screams out her frustration and disappointment. And she sings her story unto the wind, that she's been betrayed and has realized her husband is in fact a seabird. The story carries on the wind and reaches the ears of her father. Thinks, right, I need to go out, I need to rescue her. And he takes his canoe. She's waiting for him on the shore. He welcomes her into the boat. They turn around, they make it back towards their village. And they're chatting. She's relieved. He's delighted to have rescued her. And at some point, they notice something on the horizon. And it comes closer. And she's like, nightmare. That's a fulmar coming to get us. And it gets closer, closer, closer. And the fulmar's flapping around their boat, demanding his wife is returned to him. She is truly mine, return her to me. And the father, Anguta, I think his name is, he refuses, like, certainly not, she's coming with me. And this fulmar starts flapping his wings harder and harder, and he flaps his wings so hard that a storm whips up, that the sea becomes more choppy. The wind picks up, the rain clouds come in and start lashing down on the boat. And with this, fear grips the father's heart. And he turns to Sedna and says, actually, maybe you should go back. You made this choice. Maybe you should go back after all, or else both of us would die. And she's like, Father, how can you even ask? How can you even suggest that I go back with this fulmar? And they start arguing. And in the end, the father throws Sedna over the side of the boat into the water. And she lands in these icy waters. She's shocked. She's devastated. It's inconceivable her father has just done that, but the will to survive grips her, and she turns, she grabs onto the edge of the boat. And he tries to prise her fingers off, but she's fighting for her life. She's gripping hard. The fulmar's still flapping. The father takes his knife and hacks off her fingers. She lets out a scream, blood spurts, her fingers fall into the water, but she carries on gripping. And he hacks at her hands, and as her hands fall, and he crunches through bone, her hands fall into the water, blood fills the sea, and she falls down too. And it said that her fingers became the seals and the walrus and the other sea creatures, and her hands became the whale. And Sedna, she went down, down, down to the bottom of the ocean, and that's where she dwells to this day. And I'm kind of reticent to tell the end because I'm aware that some of the cultural nuance will be lost on me. But as I understand it, Sedna is the goddess of the ocean. And when the sea is stormy and she withholds her animals, it's said to be that it's because she was angry. And the story, as I hear it, is that in such times they would get a shaman to go and visit Sedna, to go down into the underworld and comb her hair, comb the mats from her hair and the dirt from her hair, because without hands, she is unable to comb her own. So that's my understanding of the story. It's I'm tentative to tell it, but it's one that when I heard it the first time, I was like, there's something else happening here that is not what I'm experiencing as a modern human.
Yeah.
And that's exciting.
Yeah, I feel myself withholding from coming to any sort of conclusion about this story, just sitting with it.
Yeah.
Just sitting with that cultural relationship with the sea, with the depth of that story, with the mix of tragedy and giving rise to life, and the humans tending her in connection with that life coming. Yeah, and the depth of that tragedy and the connection of that with life is just there's something profound as the ocean there.
Yeah, it's raw. It's I think that's the right position, not to try and analyze it too much, just to appreciate it. But yeah, I can tell you that story wouldn't come out of Europe. That's what I feel.
Yeah. How blessed we are to hear this story from such a distant land. And as you say, it's from a culture so different from what we've experienced, and so holding it lightly and with honor. And I think that is maybe a very good way to be in relationship with the stories of other lands. To be in respect and honor and considerate of etiquette. Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thanks
for inviting that. That wasn't one that felt close to me when I turned up on the call. So nice to revisit it.
Yeah, and coming back to what invited that story, we're talking about how a good old story from different cultures in different ways, defies our modern tendency to find single meanings and binaries. And I feel like the best analogy is an ecosystem.
Yeah.
Because you enter into a forest or enter into the ocean, it's like, which is the most important part? What's the one part that's like the key part? They're all part of it. It's to enter into an ecosystem.
That's exactly what was coming to mind before, as you spoke it. It's like this sort of like systems, like living systems. I kind of feel like stories match that. We get these living systems of stories that kind of speak to each other. You don't want just one story. You don't want just like one plant in your garden, one tree in your forest, one animal in your landscape. It's like these different beings interact with each other and feed each other and ideally find a kind of symbiosis. And somehow, I mean, it's probably a bit abstract, but somehow I feel stories doing the same thing.
Hmm.
There's this kind of symbiosis of stories, and we need a healthy cosmology of stories
Hmm.
to keep us sane, to turn to in different times, to return to at different times in our lives, and find ourselves gravitating to another moment in the story. And what I love about these old folk tales and myths is they've been passed down by cultures that, I guess, like had a quality of integrity and sustainability
Mm.
and self-sufficiency, the ability to live within their means that we don't get close to nowadays.
Hmm.
So all the codes of survival for a particular region, a particular community, would have been coded into their cosmology of stories. And we can kind of access that by picking up some of these old stories and sharing them nowadays, even if we don't understand everything, even if we don't know why they valued those stories exactly or why they were worth preserving, we still get to
Hmm.
bathe in their waters. And I think we still get nourishment in that way through accessing them.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And to the listeners, of course, this is an obvious point, but one that bears emphasizing is that each of us, our ancestors, if you go back a ways, all of our ancestors were embedded in place and culture. And yeah, the modern word sustainable, which we have because we're so unsustainable,
Yeah.
but integrated with place.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm thinking also this word culture,
Mm.
isn't it lovely that the same word is used for the culture of our gut?
Uh,
We're learning science, we're learning about how we have all these different kinds of bacteria and life forms inside us that help us digest food. And so
yeah.
sometimes I think culture might be, I don't want to be reductionist, say this is the only thing, but one way that helps, one metaphor that helps me to understand culture is this bacteria of the gut. So it's a way of being in relationship with the world in the same way that the bacteria in our gut help us to be in relationship with food. And if I have very depleted bacteria, then it's very reduced what I can
Mm.
eat. And so if I have very depleted stories, I'll see the world in binaries. I'll see the world, well, who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy?
Mm.
Or, how does this make me money? Or if I have very depleted
Yeah.
stories, so I only have a limited capacity to really take things in. Whereas rich
Yeah.
diversity of contradictory stories and inconclusive and overlapping, just like all these bacteria, they're not in lines in our gut. They're not ordered according to categories. They're overlapping in all these wonderful ways, and that's what helps us to digest all these different kinds of food. And so with
Mm.
story, it's like I feel like we can be in relationship with the world if we've heard stories that help us in those ways. If I hear a story about a person very different from myself, it helps me to be in relationship with a
Yeah.
person if I meet them in real life, a different culture with animals. It's almost like stories come first and then comes the capacity to relate with the world in those ways.
Yeah. I think it's a really good point. I think, certainly through understanding story, I think like there is this whole train of thought that humans are the storytelling animal. It's how we
Mm-hmm.
make sense of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it is, if we come back to like modern media, I think they know this.
Mm-hmm.
They know how to scapegoat someone, they know how to skew a conversation so it's good and bad, and repeat the same imagery, repeat the same reductionist statements, and you can begin to feel like, yeah, I don't know, you don't trust these people over there. Whereas if you
Mm-hmm.
hear the stories from that culture, if you share food with that culture, if you understand their place in the world and maybe their particular form of wisdom, like it's enriching.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, from my travel, like when I've traveled, I think you find
Like you
people
went
are
to
people.
Jordan. I remember you said in one of the
Yeah,
videos I saw, you'd come back from Jordan and you said the people there are very different from what we see in the media. you know, the people in the Middle East, and having steeped in some of their stories and experienced hospitality and got a sense of being in that culture, it's like the media doesn't hold a candle to that.
It was amazing. It was so humbling. It's been one of the most enriching experiences I've had in recent years. Because even though okay, or I know, it's like all the propaganda around Iraq post 9/11, you know, it's not the full truth. It's a small selective version of what's going on. But I didn't have an alternative story of richness.
Right.
So to go to Jordan and meet really feisty, well-educated women organizing storytelling conferences, to see the quality of kinship and brotherhood that's in the fabric of Islam, to hear the beauty of the imam's chant coming through speakers and washing across the town, to feel a quality of spiritual inquiry and sense making that's on the surface of the culture there, whereas it's buried pretty deep in the apathetic West, where I could feel it close to the surface. The food, the hospitality, the story sharing. I was just really touched. And I was like, I would have been touched anyway, but I was doubly struck by meeting people from a part of the world where the story I'm told through the news channels only revolves around cliches like an idea of terrorism, authoritarianism, whatever else, abuse. And I was like, okay, I'm not to say there wouldn't be those things don't happen at all, but there's a lot more. There's a rich culture, and I also heard stories of people cleared from Palestine in 1948. And I was like, I haven't heard this story before. I've got a reasonable global interest, and I haven't heard of the Nakba. And to meet people who'd been cleared from Palestine at that time, to meet people descended from people cleared from Palestine, and to hear of the checkpoints they had to go through to travel in the region, to hear of diversion of water from the River Jordan. So the Red Sea was drying up. Like, it's interesting to get a sense of the wider political landscape through visiting. And certainly being in Jordan for 2 weeks doesn't make me, I'm not the authority on what's happening there. There's still so much I don't understand. But I feel I got such a rich insight that it blew my mind. And I'm fundamentally just grateful for the hospitality and the sense of friendship that I made with people there. And sorry, God, I could talk about Jordan for a long time. I didn't realize that was, and also the sense of enchantment. I could feel what it might feel like for an older, Northern European traveler to arrive in this desert land back in like 1500s or something, and imagining people with all their kind of traditional dress and their exotic jewelry and decorations and camels and desert. And I was like, yeah, this does feel like if you're going from a boggy island in the north of Europe in the ocean to this land, it's very other. Aesthetically, it's as other as you can get. And that's enchanting and terrifying at the same time. And I feel like maybe we have a choice if we choose to feel the wonder or feel the terror. And that's
in either way, we can't control it.
Maybe
either way, it's bigger than us.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the fear of the media is try to make a narrative so small that it can be controlled, as opposed to the reality, which is beyond anyone's understanding, really. The richness of culture. And I love that, just that even okay, this Western media is biased, and not giving a full picture. But even though you knew that, it's not enough if you don't have a rich story to fill that space. You know, just being counter to something, skeptical of something, of a you know, anemic narrative isn't enough. It's necessary to bring in the richness.
Yeah, it's like fill the void.
Yeah, it's not
You know
enough
what?
just to stop eating junk food. It's like
Yeah,
bring in a rich diet, different kinds of foods.
yeah. And it's one thing to hear the alternative stories. It is like a linear story. Like it would be an alternative to just hear, this is what happens in Jordan. This is to hear one story about an alternative version of the Middle East, but
Right.
it's so much more when we hear stories, hear songs, speak to people, eat food, like get that visceral witnessing. And
Wow.
I think stories can be a good vehicle for that. You know, they give us a little flavor, they give us a little sample. Stories well told can transport us to another place and time and give us like a visceral experience of other cultures and other parts of the world.
Yeah, I think so. It's opening up, Dougie, this whole topic, which maybe is for another conversation. I'd love to have you back on. It's about the relationship of story to land. I'll say I spent quite a lot of time in India, and one of the things that really drew me there was pilgrimage, something that's not very prominent in the West. I know there's the one Camino de Compostela in Spain that many people take, whether Catholic or not. There's a group in England called the British Pilgrimage Trust, who next time I go there, I would love to go on some pilgrimages. They go to old wells, and there's these stories connected with the place. In my experience in India, there's every year for a long time, I'd go on a month-long pilgrimage, and we walked a lot of places, and each place had a story connected with it. And it's reminding me what you're saying, because we didn't visit the places in the same order each year. It's not that the stories all lined up and and there's the conclusion. It's more like exploring a web, and they overlap with each other in different places. And those are places of wonder. There's, oh, what do we make of this? You know, these stories overlapping in this way and contradictions. This was a lot to do with the land of Krishna in Vrindavan, which is somewhat northern India. So this web of stories, I think everywhere in the world where there's people, there's a web of stories connected with certain places, and those stories connect with each other just as the places connect with each other, and just as people move between those places. It feels like they're the stories of people, and they're also the stories of the land. They're both, you know, they're not exclusively human creations. Stories of the cosmos. In connection with the earth.
I think that's when it gets exciting. And
stories of the other world, like, you know, in Scotland, Ireland, England, there's underneath the ground, there's many other beings, and the other world's always very close. And particular places are linked with the other world in particular ways.
It's a whole big area, like stories attached to place, and can give a place a meaning, or can, you know, remind us of something in a place that we wouldn't perceive without that story. You know, we might not be looking in the same way, or we might not have our filters might not be sharp, or they might be I think stories can assist with perception, and stories will tell us what was associated with a place by people who once lived in like really close kinship with the landscape, and possibly closer kinship with their ancestors or the other world. People who had to be switched on, you know, it's like if you're not switched on as a hunter-gatherer person, you die. Like you
Uh-huh.
do. You need to pay attention. And it's not
Yeah.
just paying attention to the news or staring at your screen or your email feed. It's like, okay, the movement of the weather, the tracking of the animals, the movement of the shoals of fish, which, how to spot a good water source in the landscape, which plants grow by which other plants, which plants are medicine, which plants are food, what the language of the bird can tell us about which predators are in the area. Like that was the sensory experience of all of our ancestors
Mhm.
in different places. That's really alive.
Mm.
That's really switched on. And it's maybe a bit of a tangent from where we started, but yeah, if we go
Mm.
back to the land, maybe those people with that style of perception that lived maybe several hundred years ago, maybe they picked something up that as a modern human, we don't pick up first time,
Mhm.
a place where the veil is thin. Maybe we
Mhm.
don't sense that thinning of the veil. But if we go with a story in our pocket, it might direct our attention towards that possibility, or it might give us some clues as to how to conduct ourselves in such places.
Mm. Mm. I love it. Well, should we start to wrap up?
Yeah, I think we could go on forever. We're getting
Yeah,
deeper
I
and
mean, I'd
deeper.
love to have you on again, at some point,
Yeah,
if you'd like that. Maybe even in person when you come here.
yeah, yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah. I wonder if there's any invitations. Invite you to give some invitations for our audience from our conversation today. Around connecting with story with place, around exploring stories from other cultures that we maybe have some stereotypes about. No shame if we have stereotypes about other cultures. It's just a lack of knowing more and experiencing more. We have what we have. So maybe, yeah, some invitations around connecting to place through story, connecting to one's own culture, to other cultures through story.
Yeah. I don't know. I guess like if the curiosity is with you, if the curiosity is with someone listening, go and find stories. And we're all we can all tell stories. So I think like yeah, go and find if you're inclined, go and find stories that you might want to tell. And I think it does pay to approach stories and older cultures with respect. Probably goes without saying. Yeah, we've all got a really distinct and unique journey with storytelling, and I feel like it's hard to give really generic invitations, but if the curiosity is there, follow the trail. I think that's the
Uh-huh.
thing. Follow the
Uh-huh.
trail. Root around in secondhand bookstores. Go and Google Celtic stories or stories from the place where your ancestors come from. Go and phone up your granny. Go to a live storytelling event. Go listen to my podcast or Theo's podcast. Or yeah, I think it's I think I just see I think I can reflect for myself like following that story trail has led to some really magical and wonderful places and some really magical and wonderful people. So I think I'm just enthusiastic about the idea of other people beginning to follow that trail. And it's not about being a storyteller. I think it's more about bathing in story and accessing non-modern perception and non-modern ways of thinking. I think that's the underappreciated gift of story, and it's out there and it's really accessible.
Mm. And coming back to the Cèilidh right at the beginning,
Mm.
I'd invite people, and I'm really thinking to do this myself, have a few people over. And it's lovely because it's a low bar to entry. Someone can
Yeah,
share a poem, someone could read a poem, and someone tells a story, someone gives a song. Like just, start bringing these pieces together. If I find a story I'm enthusiastic for, it's like, okay, I want to
yeah, yeah,
share it. I'm not on a stage. It doesn't need to be professional. It's just share it with some friends.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, when I started out, that's what I did. I was like, I want to tell stories. I want a safe audience. I invited friends round. I was like, okay, the invitation is to try something new. If you're a really
Mm.
accomplished singer-songwriter,
Uh,
bring a new song. You know, if you've got a poem you've recently written, bring that.
uh,
I'm going to tell a story. I've never told a story before. And that was a really kind of, yeah, that was explicit for me because maybe I was, I don't know, nervous. I
mhm,
just made it as safe as I could and
mm.
got some traction and thought, oh, wait a minute, I could probably do this in different
All right,
places.
you're not the only one bringing something new.
Yeah, yeah,
That's a nice strategy. I like
yeah.
that.
Yeah, if you want to kind of safeguard your own, yeah, whatever ego in that space, that's what I
Uh,
did.
oh, that's
Kids,
a good little
too.
technique there.
Yeah, yeah, kids, find a willing child. There's lots of them about.
Uh,
There's lots of parents will happily lend you a listening child if you can
uh,
occupy them for a few minutes.
uh. Oh, I love it. Well, that's beautiful. And also, I want to direct people towards your offerings. So you're coming to the coast here. This, if you're listening to this when it's aired, then that's very soon. I'll give some links to the different venues that Dougie's coming to in the show notes. And you also have a podcast. I didn't realize that actually. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, it's called Tales for Our Times
Hmm.
and just recorded an interview with Tad Hargrave from
Oh,
your part of
okay.
the world.
Yeah.
So that will be the
He's
next.
been on mine as well before.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so he's the
beautiful.
next one. But yeah, a real mix. Sometimes it's me talking, telling a story. Sometimes I have a guest, mostly rooted in storytelling with a little touch of rewilding in there too.
Okay. And I know you also offer online courses and in-person courses as well. Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. I've got a course called Myth as Medicine that will probably come in the autumn. And that's like I guess like a whole story cycle. I kind of plotted a range of northern myths on what we might call a medicine wheel or a week kind of natural cycle. Like what is a good story in the east when our journey begins?
Hmm.
What is a good story for the south when the sun is at its highest? What is the
Hmm.
story of the west where the sun sets and we gather in by the fire? What's the story of the north in the night in the deepest winter?
Hmm.
So it's an 8 story cycle, and each week we delve into it, and I give a bunch of activities that support with that. So that's a lot of fun. I've had really good feedback off that. We'll be doing that in the autumn. Um, yeah, there's always different things happening. Like Instagram is probably a good place to pick up on what I'm doing. It's just Dougie Mackay story. Um, and the big thing, obviously, that seems to be taking most of my attention is this tour of British Columbia and a little
Hmm.
bit into Washington. So most of the attention is going on that. We've got gigs in Duncan, Nanaimo, Powell River, Victoria, Salt Spring Island, down into Port Townsend, Vancouver, and we finished that with a 4 day mythopoetic, like Scottish mythopoetic retreat.
Hmm.
So that's something that I'm kind of excited about, and that's something that will, I think we could go really deep over like 4 days, and it'll be, yeah, steeping in some of the bigger Celtic tales and also looking at some of the key kind of cultural moments of like Scottish folk history, stuff like that. So that's all happening soon in your part of the world. Um, yeah,
Hmm.
maybe that's it for now.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, some lovely offerings. You'll see me at some of them for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Dougie. This has been very rich.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the great chat and questions. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening, and I will link all of that in the show notes below. I hope to see you at one of these events on the West Coast here, or perhaps in Dougie's class online. I am seriously thinking of taking that myth as medicine. Until the next, happy storytelling.